So, welcome back, everybody, to BRUBBLE, a podcast exploring young voices and perspectives from in and around the Brussels bubble. And we're back after a brief hiatus where I ran off to the beautiful snowy shores of Canada and received my Canadian citizen. Still a Dutch citizen, so, keeping my foot on both continents here. But I'm excited really to get back in here and analyze what the biggest stories of spring 2023 were. So in this podcast, we'll be presenting some of what we thought were the most important things that happened during the last few months, as well as taking a bigger look at the bigger picture that's unfolding in Europe's place in the world's geopolitical scene. And doing that, as always, I'm joined with some of my favorite minds from in and around this gloomy but turning brighter Brussels bubble that we're in here today. Julien, you're sitting in the corner looking characteristically French with your turtleneck. How are you feeling today?
I mean, I left the beret at home, but I'm feeling good.
Fair enough.
And hi, I guess I'll introduce myself. So I'm Julien. I'm a French political consultant, geopolitical expert, and the editor of the French Dispatch, which is now feeding information into the European Commission. So
congratulations.
It's been a great year so far.
There we go. And you're about a year old at the publication, or just over a year?
That's a very good question, actually. I think it's just about a year over.
Yeah. So for explosive growth in quality boots on the ground European journalism.
I'm doing my best.
Check out the French Dispatch. Let's talk about another boot on the ground sitting beside me. Joao, bad introduction, but tell us, how have you been feeling? What did you do in life?
Well, I've been feeling well, and thank you for again another opportunity to be here with you guys. You know how much I really love to do this. And just a quick introduction to myself. My name is Joao. I am Portuguese, and I used to work with the Recovery and Resilience Facility and the European Semester, and now I'm saving the internal market one barrier at a time.
Working at DG Grow.
Yes, working at DG Grow.
There we go.
European Commission.
Finally. And finally, last but not least, Nikoloas, you're sitting here a lot sunnier than last time. If those watching the video version of this podcast on YouTube will notice that there's a distinct transformation. How's your life been going?
Indeed. Well, number one, I started prioritizing my 8 hours of sleep, and life has just turned around, so sleep early, kids. But yes, indeed, my name is Nikoloas. I'm from Greece. I work at the Secretariat General in the European Commission, much like Joao. I work in the unit briefings to the President and Vice Presidents, which to some may seem very boring, but to me it's incredibly interesting. I get to engage with so many topics every day, completely different, and yet still learning so much and getting so much experience. I'm here today to speak on my own behalf and no one else, as a citizen of Europe. And I'm really excited to discuss with these fellas here today.
Yeah, I think it's quite an exciting time too to be discussing this stuff, because when I was reflecting on the past month, it seemed, or months actually, because we're going to be looking at the entire spring semester, so what I consider January till end of April, basically. And it seemed to me that it was kind of slow, but kind of building. It was almost ominous. And the more and more I read the stories, the more and more I read the headlines, the more almost pessimistic I became. And, as a European citizen and a transatlantic citizen nowadays, this has me not worried, but concerned, I suppose, about the months coming up. How we'll see the changes. Because I remember last year, the September, November, Octobers of that year were packed with geopolitical developments. Mm-hmm. And I feel like tracing what we're looking at today might be a way to read what will come in the future. So let's start here, because I'm going to ask each of you, what do you think the biggest story of spring 2023 was? Joao, you're sitting here pensive, as always, with your notes, well prepared.
Damn, I'm the first one to start this time around.
Yeah.
I mean, as echoing you, there is a lot of things that have been happening since January. I kind of make brought a selection of two topics basically to speak about. One of them I would like to highlight is the release of the communication on the Raw Materials Act and the Net Zero Industry Act. So I think these are two topics, two regulations that are very important for our strategic future in the European Union, that will, in the future, help us to reply to one of our basic needs, which is our green and digital transition. So basically what we have here is the Raw Materials Act will actually allow us to have more easiness in permitting and exploiting raw materials in the European Union, and also try to diversify our sources of partnerships for us to get the raw materials that we need in order to drive this transition. And second is the Net Zero Industry Act, which is like the major industry focal point in terms of driving a transition for a greener industry that we have here in Europe. And it will boost like the acceleration for us in order to reduce CO2 emissions and prepare our economy for the future and a more greener future. So this is one of the major points that I would like to focus, that I think it was a huge achievement for us.
Let's look at that for a second then.
Yeah.
And I really want to ask you then, given you're focusing on a legislative background and around the table too, do you think it's enough?
I would say that it is not enough, at least at this stage, but it is a start. Mm-hmm. It is a starting point. We actually needed to reshuffle and rethink what we wanted as a strategy point for our raw materials, because it's very important for us to get the basic raw materials that we need in order to drive our transformation in our unit and our industry, and in order not to be left behind in relation to our two competitors, the United States and China. And this would actually bolster our capacity of being self-reliant on those raw materials. So it's a very good step forward.
Yes. It's interesting you mentioned our two competitors, the US and China.
Yes.
Because not everybody would point out them being the competitors on the same level.
They're not the only competitors. I just wanted to
exactly.
chime in.
Should we chime in? Yes, and we'll get back to you, Joao, in a second.
I always like looking at international politics from a more geopolitical perspective. Of course, that biases me towards some stories more than others. I agree with what Joao said. The Critical Raw Materials Act, the Net Zero Industry Act, the Sovereignty Fund, everything that the EU is doing is a very good step in the positive direction. They've been done in quite expedited fashion. The proposals have been prepared, which is outstanding for Europe, because there is a very strong hope that these will finish before the elections of 2024, when the institutions will enter a bit of a period of slower legislation, let's say, because the new legislators will arrive in the parliament. The new commission will need to be elected, chosen first by the council and then elected by the parliament. So it's good that we're doing this now, and indeed there's no time like the present. However, I think I would agree with you, Simon. For me, the spring, and I just want to say to the viewers that we consider spring anything after January, so just so that there's no misunderstanding. I think the past few months, at least compared to what we have been used to since pretty much the beginning of COVID, might have been some of the slowest months that we see. I mean, we keep hearing about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The weapons are slowly but very, very surely arriving. A lot of advanced weaponry, very high value items, and we're bolstering the capabilities and the capacities of Ukraine, which is exactly what we should be doing, and then some. And I think with that, even though it was slow, I think China's visit to Moscow was Xi Jinping's was one of the biggest stories for me in the new year, because number one, we have seen in China that was very slow to pick up to get on board with geopolitically what was happening in Ukraine, and they were seemingly trying to play not both sides, but they were trying to strike a balance, and that was very obvious by the fact that they were much more quiet on this. But I think with the visit to Russia, their peace plan and their willingness to mediate, they've kind of forcefully come onto the main table when it comes to the war. I'm not commenting whether this is good or bad. I think it remains to be seen, and it also very much depends on the side that you're sitting on. But I certainly think in terms of the geopolitical ramifications that it has, it's huge. And also it showed that China is supplying Russia with some armor and weapons. They're small caliber weapons like assault rifles and things like that. So not air fighters, tanks, and so on and so forth. And usually just some armors and ballistic vests for shoulders. And it's not through official Chinese companies, but rather through second and third tier intermediaries. But it does show that China has picked its side, which was no surprise to anyone.
Talking about China, because sorry to divert from your critical raw materials topic.
No.
But I also did want to touch on China because looking back over the headlines, I did think that their visit to Moscow was significant. But I was thinking, at least from the Brussels bubble perspective, the more significant part was, and as you might be able to catch in a podcast episode in a week or two, was von der Leyen and Macron's visit to China. And what we saw emerging there, and what I predict will be influencing the discourse in the next months, is how we as the EU will approach China moving forward. Will we take von der Leyen's preferred approach of de-risking, or Macron's approach of decoupling, mirroring the American approach? And I think it's a really interesting balance, which the hammer hasn't completely landed yet upon, because there's still these tensions drawing us in either direction, especially with our American allies strongly preferring one of the options over the other.
And the Canadians, let's not forget.
Yeah, we're a great partner there too.
Indeed.
Julian, I mentioned Macron here, and you didn't immediately,
Flip the table.
He was just waiting for the hammer to fall.
Exactly. But do you want to comment maybe on the China ramifications, or do you want to go into what I suspect to be a monologue on what you think the most significant thing was that happened?
No, I leave the monologues for my colleagues. But for me, it's I don't think there's ever any one single theme or event that is big in politics or geopolitics, because you can't boil things down to that simple level, because that's simply just not how international politics works anymore. I mean, you have everything that was mentioned today. You have NATO being reinforced now. You have the fight in Turkey over whether they're going to give Sweden the accession to NATO and all this kind of stuff.
They're not.
Which plays into everything and how this goes. Then you have the upcoming European elections, and all of the parties are now geared up and starting to throwing punches in a sort of preliminary fighting stance right now. But then on top of that, you have other things abroad that are going to impact what's happening in Europe. For example, we now know who's going to be fighting and contesting the 2024 US elections.
Yeah.
And the fact that Biden's looking quite good now is big. And we had the failed insurrection in Brazil as well. That showed that there are serious limits now, and most states are ready to combat these kind of January 6th style riots that we saw in the US, which is going to make the far right feel more nervous in Europe, and also make pro-democrat, pro-liberal parties feel more secure. And then on top of that, you have the Macron stuff. Because a lot of what we're seeing now, at least at the European level, is an internal and an external fight about what our role and what our reaction to everything should be. Because the whole fight around the Macron thing, and we're going to go into this later, I think, probably, was...
You're here, so...
Let's get into it now. We're here.
Yeah, sure. But did Macron say all these things that basically destroyed the unity of the EU, and then abandon our allies and tell America to go F itself and all this kind of stuff? Or was Macron being what Macron has always been, and someone saying, we absolutely have to have strategic autonomy because we can't be played with between these two great powers and whatever else is coming down the lane? And I think that was a part of the greater conversation with all of the events that you suggested in the outline and everything that was been mentioned so far, and that we are still fighting over what the hell we want to be. And I think that's going to be more and more of a fight as we get closer to the EP elections, where a lot of the pro-European and liberal and democratic parties are going to hemorrhage seats. And the whole discussion is now more, where are we going, like always, and can we actually get to where we want to be when no one can agree?
Yeah. But I think the other question, I think that's what we started with Joao here, is sure, we can look at what we want to be, but we still have to make sure the basics are in place, right? And that's why stuff like the critical raw materials, the green industrial stuff, that's why they have, I think, such a cogent role to play, because a lot of, I think, our politicians, especially certain French ones, have aspirations of what we need to be. But can we even achieve that with how we're structured right now? Joao, did you have any thoughts or something to share maybe?
Well, that's complicated. I mean, it entails in the previous discussion that we already had in one of the other one of our podcasts on what type of European Union we want to be. You know, so is it possible to achieve what perhaps Macron wants without reforming the European Union, without revising the treaties, without revising the institutions, naming the role of the Council? Is it possible? And this will again be connected to another thing that we can approach, which is what is the role of the European Union in the world today? Is it possible to have an European Union that is solid in the world stadium, without actually having hard power? So this, and also without guaranteeing its own autonomy, its own strategic autonomy. Is it possible? What degree should we compromise between what is our interests? In this case, concerning China, for instance, should we look China as a major economic partner, or should we look at more in a strategic partnership way? So should we de-risk or decouple?
Yeah.
You know, which one should we balance?
Man, we're sitting here talking about de-risking and decoupling and all these fancy words.
And it's the same thing, really.
It's not
Well,
really the same vision.
it's not the same thing.
It's not the same vision, but the truth is, like, it's staring us right in the face. China is not a friendly country.
Yeah,
Just because we have very strong economic ties does not mean it's a friendly country. Let's take that out of our minds right now. Because if tomorrow what is happening today in Ukraine happens in Taiwan, then we start asking ourselves, but are we relying too much on Russian gas now? Should we cut it? What are we going to do? But no one told us anything until now, which is, we're kidding ourselves. Let's be honest. Because why? Money talks, again. And just to do a bit of foreshadowing, it's the same thing as where I'm standing from as a Greek with Turkey, which is why so many European member states give weaponry and have strong economic ties and have like quarters of their electorates that come from some particular countries. And they're not willing to see the truth in its face. They're trying to find some fancy terms. I agree with the comments that Macron made that Europe should not be a vassal of the United States. I don't think that we are, but I think we free ride on America for a lot of things because it suits us. First and foremost, defense. How many countries 2 years ago met the 2% NATO criteria, and now everyone is pumping money in defense like there's no tomorrow, and yet we still cannot find, for instance, we still cannot produce the proper amount of 155 millimeter shells and ammunition for the needs of Ukraine, and there is like one war going on in one country. I mean, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but what happens if multiple wars break out on many fronts? Because look at what's happening in Sudan. Maybe tomorrow it might be Taiwan. Maybe it might be some crazy person with nuclear bombs. And nowadays there are quite a few of them. So what happens then?
And it's important to point out there's only one European crazy person who might be able to have a nuclear bomb.
There are a lot of crazy Europeans.
Yeah, but there's only one.
There's only one with nuclear capabilities.
And that conversation was also springing up again.
Nuclear capabilities we're willing to use.
Regardless,
willing to use are two different things,
no.
man. I'm just talking about
but before we derail too much, I think
no, but
Julien
nuclear
wanted
capabilities, there's at least three.
Which?
United Kingdom and France,
Okay,
aside from Russia.
We're talking about the EU.
Yeah.
And anyways,
but
Julien,
in the broader scope of the conflict.
Yeah, fair enough. Julien, you want to respond to a few points that he was making on Macron.
Yeah, but it's more like I feel like I get that it's presented as two different things, the de-risking and decoupling and all this kind of stuff, but ultimately they're achieving the same thing, is that we're too dependent on China for a lot. We need to onshore lots of businesses and industries and this kind of thing to secure ourselves. And I know politicians like to talk about how, we absolutely have to de-risk because this is better than decoupling, because at least then we're still engaged, but we're coming away.
For the sake of
And
the
then
conversation,
on the other
explain
side,
what they are. The
Yeah,
differences.
that we should do it
Because
first.
we're
Like, I mean,
talking with these fluff words,
Yeah, of
course.
and it's literally just foam. So let's.
yeah, this is why I don't mention these fluff words usually and just talk straight to the.
But okay,
you
let's
know.
explain them.
But
what
basically,
we think it
decoupling is sort of separating the economy away, in the very simple terms, away from China and whoever else we want to decouple from, and de-risking is more staying engaged but reducing our dependencies.
yes.
Yeah, so
Very
the
simply.
big policy difference would basically be technology bans, certain bans on
Yeah.
certain products, whereas the bans are more associated with decoupling, whereas de-risking is still retaining that friendly allure, I suppose.
No, there's still
The
like
money
bans
talks
involved.
Yeah, but the real issue I find with both of these approaches is even if we want to go for a de-risking approach, there's still Europeans, when we deal with issues like China, we still want to have a human rights or values-based approach. And I don't know if that works with partners like China.
Yeah, but it doesn't work with the US either.
But they're not pretending to. They're
Yeah, but-
decoupling.
Yeah, sure, but I mean, the US does a lot of really awful things too that we kind of let slide because they're the US and they're better, and it's not as egregious as the China. But again,
We can't
using these
compare
terms.
The US and China. I understand that the US is hegemon, and certainly there are skeletons.
No, but I'm
in
saying that
the
they don't do the same thing at the same scale. That's what I just said.
But this,
But there's still
really
some
like how
shady
you're
things.
funneling them Macron's words here. 'cause
No,
this is the same
but it's
argument
true.
he was basically making with this.
No, but it's like
juicy quotes
look at
about
some of the
student
shit that's
economy.
happening in the US right now. Like the states are just banning abortion left, right, and center. You got people dying because they can't get abortions, and like we're gonna pretend that there's no problem in the US. Like sorry, like no. And on top of that, like again, I'm specifically staying away from commission talking points and statements because it's written in political linguistics that's not very interesting to the average person. But there's a problem in the way that we're approaching this topic where we assume that we have a choice in how we engage with China, whether we can de-risk or decouple, as the reality is we need to become as autonomous as possible, but in the long term, we're still going to have dependencies on China simply because of how global trade networks function. Same with the US. Everybody's talking, yeah, let's get away from the US. And in some ways we should, because we have enough capacity to build what we need in Europe. But there's always these eternal pissing matches between the countries who want to stick with the US because we can't abandon our friends who have been our friends for 70 years now. Whereas some of us are saying, well, we can still be friends with them while just not being dependent on everything they ask. And dependent on what we need, and then leaving ourselves exposed politically. And this is the problem, is that people don't seem to understand that neither decoupling or de-risking are very different from one another because the end result will be the same. We'll have dependencies here, there, and everywhere. It's like in the EU, certain countries will produce more simply because they have a history of producing things. And then internally, what's going to happen at the political level in the EU is people will say, oh, but we're too dependent on France for Rafales or whatever. And then, oh, Greeks producing too many bullets. What happens if Greece can't produce bullets anymore? And then we're going to be like, well, let's de-risk from Greece and move stuff to, I don't know, Albania.
Well, I'll give you 30 seconds to respond and then go for you. Go for it, Joao.
No, it's just, yeah, I think it is important. Even if you think that de-risking and decoupling ultimately can mean the same thing, the issue here is some countries, as you were saying, cannot in the European Union can also continue producing. But the major issue that the European Union leaders are actually fearing by now, with the IRA and now with also some policies from China to actually
Inflation Reduction Act of the United
yes,
States.
the Inflation Reduction Act.
You're in charge of all
Yeah,
of
you're in charge of all. You are in charge to defend the viewers that do not understand our jargon. Sorry for that. The Inflation Reduction Act, but the main issue is the European Union understands that is losing leverage to these two competitors.
Yeah.
In the sense that we used to produce, and now we understand that we cannot produce in the same rate or capability that we used to.
Yeah.
And if we completely decouple from China or from the US, but especially from China, European leaders fear that European companies will start to choose our competitors as a place to start
I
producing and exporting.
feel like I need to call this a few here now, but sorry.
But I mean, even just so I can just add to what he's saying here.
Go for it. Yeah.
Like, I hear what you're saying, and I agree, but this is kind of also where a lot of Macron statements in China were coming from. Like, put it this way, we've been fighting our own competition authority in the EU on creating giants who could potentially have the capacity to combat with US and Chinese giants and even what we thought were Russian giants 2 years ago. But we've already seen that because of this, we've weakened our own positions. And on top of that, like one fact that baffled me when I heard about the IRA impact, they doubled investments with the IRA in manufacturing. In the space of like 6 months of it being active, they doubled investment. And investment in the US in manufacturing was huge. And we do not have any capacity to do something like that in the EU. And we are, look, sorry guys, close your ears if you're below the age of 18. We are fucked if we can't do something similar. Because this is like, we talk and talk and talk and talk, including on the BRUBBLE, subscribe, whatever, wherever. But we're not capable of actually having the grown-up discussions about doing stuff like this. And we had the fights over the Buy European Act and, pumping money into manufacturing. But then there's always some commissioner somewhere or someone else who comes in and says, oh, but we can't do that because this is going to break single market rules or whatever. And I think this is, to go back to your question 20 minutes ago, this is kind of where Macron was coming at with the strategic autonomy angle, is that we need to give ourselves the capacity to actually do this stuff because we're going to fall behind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Make me proud I kept my European passport here.
Yes, I will. And I'm going to fire bullets across all sides. So, a little bit of background. The EU has very, very strong and very strict state aid rules. That means how much support, usually in the form of financial support and subsidies, member states, the EU countries can give to companies to support them. So DG Comp, the competition service in the Commission, usually is the one that oversees a lot of these things, and there are levels to how much support you can give. There are, of course, exceptions to the exceptions. Now, these exceptions have multiplied during the pandemic. Then the war started, and then they kept on multiplying, and now all these efforts, the Net Zero Industry Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, Sovereignty Fund, all this, which does not matter for people to know each point and each pillar, but these will relax and will essentially for the European, in the European law, they will codify within the secondary law these relaxation of state aid rules. Now, what that means is that 2/3 of the exceptions the past 3 years on state aid rules have come from 2 countries. Julien, you want to guess which those 2 are?
I know one's France.
And the second
for
one?
Sure.
It's not difficult.
The second one, wasn't it Germany or something?
Yes, it was. So obviously Greece cannot compete with the sort of state aid, let alone countries like Malta, countries like Estonia, like Cyprus, by virtue not of their per capita GDP, but just their GDP in absolute value.
Raw economic power.
Raw
basically.
economic power, just like good old-fashioned hard power. Now, the EU is trying to alleviate some of that by increasing the funding that we give to companies at EU level.
Rightly so.
Rightly so, but that still creates inequalities.
Yeah.
So that, as a Greek, I'm strictly talking as a Greek citizen, but also a European one, is quite unfair. At the same time, however, we were reactive, not proactive, when it came to the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes.
It's not like the US is not an ally. Yes, maybe sometimes they're strategic and they look at things in relative gains and not absolute ones, but they're our ally. And I mean, Joe Manchin, the senator in the United States, who's Democrat, by the way, he came out and said, which is not right or wrong, I'm just stating what he said, is that you knew about it. Telling us, you, Europeans, knew about it. And we didn't do anything. Yeah. And that goes back to, we have something that works, and that is the European Peace Project. Anyone that says that it doesn't work is stubborn. And the virtue that we have not had in these EU member states, a war the past 70 or so years is a testament to that. But is this system sustainable? No. And we need to look at how can we modernize it, not in 10 years and to be reacting to what is happening today, but to fix it now, reacting to what is happening in the world now. And I cannot agree with Macron saying that the de-risking was what Macron said, right?
Decoupling.
Decoupling, yes, sorry. Even we get confused. I think we need to take a hard power approach and see that China does not look eye to eye with us on anything other than filling their pockets with our money and our technology. So there is no yes, but there is only you're committing systemic genocide. You're about to invade a sovereign neighboring country, and the list just keeps piling on, man. There is no working together, because we saw what happens when we work together with these people, and our friends in the Baltics and in Eastern Europe were screaming about this for years. And yet, what did we do? We increased our dependencies, reminiscent metaphorically to a junkie, to a single energy producer that when the time came, and the time did come, just like it will come with China, they grabbed us by the balls.
Not all of us, though.
We were, pardon my French, désolé. And then we were caught like a deer in the headlights at night. We were like, oh my God, what is happening? I'll tell you what's happening. Another country is invading another sovereign European country.
Yeah, but we weren't the ones who were saying, let's take more Russian oil. We were screaming at Germany for shutting down the nuclear reactors, you know?
Still, let's wrap this up a little bit. Joao, do you want to take the last word? I started with you. You can finish this.
I can finish.
Go for it.
I kind of don't understand what you are not in favor of Macron's position of decoupling.
No, I'm in favor pretty much of
decoupling.
Of what President von der Leyen said, that
The de-risking.
Okay.
we need to look at more seriously.
But as far as I understood from your speech,
I agree with this, actually. What you said. Go on.
as far as I understood with your speech, you are accusing the European Union or some European members to being dependent on China for technology and stuff like that.
I'm not accusing anyone.
No,
I'm
yeah,
just
but
stating facts.
But what I mean is, and when Macron actually asked for the harder position, you said, no, I do not agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
So just now with your intervention, but maybe you were just referring to de-risking or something like that, because you're telling.
Maybe I got confused.
Or maybe I got
decoupling.
or maybe I misunderstood, because what it looked like was you do not want the European Union to take the risk on being dependent on China.
Not on China. I do not want us to take the risk on being dependent on any single regime.
Okay, we were talking about China, and because of the things that they do and stuff like that, and the genocide and so
which
on
is
and
the
so
Macron
forth.
position.
So
Whereas von der Leyen was still more.
we're still more cautious. So
Yeah.
basically, trying to reduce our dependencies while keeping channels to make dialogue.
Exactly.
You know, like positioning the European Union as a middle ground between the US
Yeah.
and China.
And if I
think
can,
here our brothers in arms are only the United States when it comes to this.
sure, but
No, I mean, I agree. I
Just-
agree with you. I was just pointing out that.
just to come in on this point, just to wrap up the Macron stuff, because I saw the famous Politico article, which was garbage and was not representative of anything, and therefore personally translated the actual interview that Macron did that got everybody pissed off. I can tell you half of what people heard about it was complete shit. And if you go to the French Dispatch, I've translated and explained every single bit, and even during that interview, he specifically says, we're not supposed to be running around and being dragged around by the US or China. And he makes a specific reference to the alliance with the US, saying, we need to work on what is actually in our interest, but more often than not, our interests will line up with the US. So we were never ever saying we're going to decouple from the US as well. We're just saying we don't want to be dependent on them for our defense in our industry. And that's the big issue. And that's something that people didn't get from the interview.
And it is also very important for us to tone down this situation, because I understand that we are
Everybody.
with all of this decoupling and the de-risking and stuff. We need to understand where we want to be positioned, and understand also how the world economy functions. You know, as Julien pointed out. I mean, if we all of a sudden start to cut down on stuff, start to cut down on all of our partnerships that we depend on, not only as final, you know, like as final products, but as intermediary products to make our economy here work, because we also import from there not only technology, but part of and components that makes our industries actually go. I mean, we cannot go forward.
Yeah.
Well, there is one place where we always look at things going forward, and that is our selection of elections, moving topics forward, as I call this little segment we're doing now.
Let Nico start it. Just let him start on Turkey.
I actually want to be the last here.
Yeah, because kind of position to these guys is, at
Yeah.
least to one of the persons here, that they can rant a little bit about a certain election coming up. But I also want to take a gander at what we took from the other elections which happened, the Finnish elections maybe, what that told us about Europe, maybe even the Scottish elections which are coming up, or maybe even take a glance all the way forward to the European elections, or we can just instead look at the juiciest one coming up, which is Turkey. But where do we want to start? Are you sure you don't want to start, Nikos?
I mean, elections in Finland, I think just I'm not Finnish. I'm also the furthest thing from an expert on Finland. But to my understanding, issues of domestic concern were more important to voters than issues of international concern, despite the fact the resounding success of Finland joining NATO, which is unprecedented and historic any way that you look at it. But to my understanding, that was a very strong determinant in the outcome of the Finnish elections. And again, I may be wrong. If I am, please do correct me. But that's from the reading that I have done and from what I have understood. That seems to be to paint a representative picture of Finland. I want to point out there's a lot of elections going on in Europe at the moment.
Yes.
Bulgaria is gearing for elections. Greece is also gearing for elections a week after the Turkish ones. I think the Turkish ones are really big just because it's the first time in 20 years, maybe with the exception of the failed coup, that Erdogan appears to be as vulnerable as he is, not just politically, but also yesterday there appeared to be a health scare, or was it the day before, where he had to stop an interview because he did not feel well. He said apparently that it's because of a stomach flu. I want to point out that when that happened, Putin was rushed back to the Kremlin, and I saw a video posted of his motorcade just speeding away from where an event that he was at the time. No relation. I'm just pointing out that it's quite funny, I guess.
Okay.
The margin for error basically in the Turkish elections appears to be very, very, very close. I don't think it's possible to call one or the other. I think the Kurdish party, and specifically the former presidential candidate and currently a person that's in prison courtesy of President Erdogan. I'm sorry if I butchered the pronunciation. Selahattin Demirtas, which is the leader of one of the Kurdish parties. They will play a very strong kingmaker role, and the fact that they have not submitted a candidate also seems to be an implicit fact that is helping Kılıçdaroğlu. Difficult names, mouthfuls.
Kemal is...
Kemal.
Yeah.
At the same
First
time,
name.
I want to point out that the national alliance that he has formed, which is the so-called Table of Six, is not as clear on a lot of things as people think. And I don't think that if, let's say, they win either the election outright with more than 50 plus 1 in May 14th, or 2 weeks later on the 29th, if there's a necessity for a second round, I don't think things are going to be the rapprochement with the EU and the West is not going to be overnight. And they've published a memorandum of understanding with like their policies and outlining a lot of things. But for instance, just some of the things, they don't really offer creative positions for dealing with the Kurdish population in Turkey. They want to deport Syrian refugees, normalize ties with Assad. They want to return to the F-35 program, but it's unclear how they're going to do, given that that they have bought that Erdogan has bought the Russian S-400 missile defense. And not to say that essentially they're continuing the very hard line on the occupied part of the island of Cyprus, the so-called TRNC.
Yeah, because my whole perspective reading about the Turkish election and getting a bit more familiar was, does this actually make a difference? whatever happens here.
It does.
It does. And
It
why
does,
is that?
but well, okay. So they say that they want to move away from the super executive presidential system that Erdogan has built into a much more stronger parliamentary democracy. Now, politicians are pretty much known to acquire power and much less to cede it. So it remains to be seen to what degree, if he gets in the position where he's the power and he's essentially this extremely powerful figure sitting atop the Turkish presidency, if he will be willing to cede this power. We don't know enough about him to know whether or not he will do it. He says that he will, but we don't know for a fact if he will or he won't. But at the same time, I think Erdogan just has developed such a cult of personality. Let's call it like it is, authoritarian regime based on very hardcore beliefs and the strong Islamism aspect to it, that I think there's no way that things don't slightly improve. Just the fact that the rhetoric will be toned down is enough for things to calm down. But in Greece and Cyprus, I don't expect much improvement.
Joe, do you want to give some other perspectives on this?
I mostly agree on Nico. Starting with Finland, just to say that, pointing out that we called here that in the previous recording session, when we did our top 10, one of the things that we approached was elections, and it was called here that actually the center-right coalition could actually win the Finnish election. Just to stress that out. And why it happened, it was actually interesting. Because we were saying that, and even when it happened in the elections and everyone was actually surprised that Sana lost, maybe it was not that surprising if you were actually paying attention to the developments throughout the months. But Nikos, I think he was referring about the potential impact of the cession to NATO in the elections. I mean, as far as I saw, the Finns actually were pretty much happy with the entrance in NATO. So I think there was a poll like 60% actually approved it. So they kind of felt that this was like a turning point for the country, and they feel like a threat. And NATO was actually the only way for them to feel secure. And perhaps the biggest issue here that made the balance, the scales turning, was again, as it has been in the other northern countries, the migration issues. Especially in this particular case, how Sana was trying to solve the budgetary issues and the much expendable social welfare state that they have there,
essentially,
by taking more migrants to make up for more debt, and also allowing more migration to come in order to build the and of course the opposition, namely the Finns, the party, actually made itself like very vocal, but also the fact that the Finns moderated their position, the Finns, the party again, for instance, in what regards to the European Union and also to migration at a certain extent, made it be more appealing to other conservative votes or to the general public, more or less like it happened in Italy, if you want to recall it. So I think for me it was not a surprise. The only surprise will be how actually they are going to form a government, because they are one deputy shorter to the absolute majority. So basically they are like 101 deputies and they have 100, the right-wing coalition. So we can actually have like a grand coalition with the Social Democrats again participating in the government. So moving on to the Turkish ones. It is interesting, this election, not only because of this geopolitical importance, but also because how high and low it has been going. You know, sometimes Kemal, so the leader of the opposition, those 6 blocks, sometimes it seems to be gaining the upper hand, other times it seems to be losing. But the interesting fact is that this guy has been around for ages in Turkey. And since 2020, he has lost all the elections plus the referendum against Erdogan. He's fairly unpopular in the country.
And especially in the coalition, he was one of the least powerful and wanted to.
But he's the biggest party. So he's the party of Atatürk. So there's a historical party. But the thing is, the two other members of the coalition, the mayor of Ankara and the mayor of Istanbul, both of them were positioned in the polls to win by a landslide against Erdogan. So they were really fairly popular. But the thing is, now I think it can run for each side, but it is likely, or there is still a chance that Erdogan still nails the election, still makes it. For the simple fact that he can still, up until the beginning of the election, as he did in the past, play the Kurdish card. So whenever there is some political insecurities in the country related to the Kurdish people, he plays that card, and it works. And the second thing is that the AKP, so the party of Erdogan, is pretty much controls the state.
Yes.
And at some degree, as we've seen in the past, at some degree, it can actually play a decisive role. So there is actually a chance for him to keep the power. But in case that he does not, Kemal, and I'm totally on your side on this one. Relations between Turkey and the European Union, it's one of the objectives. So one of the basic, they put forward like a memorandum of understanding that basically the topics that coalition wants to promote. If they are, it's not a government thing, but a government program, but it's like a memorandum. And they say that they want to improve relationships with the European Union in view of a membership. Yes, it's stated there. And in view of full membership, so that's their goal. But I don't know how they are going to proceed, because usually when you have a changing government, you don't have a changing perspective geopolitically wise, because geography and its elements still play a role. So if there is still a war there, like they have in Syria, most likely a changing in cabinet will not make any difference to that regard. We will see if they will be more hawkish or not, but one thing I know for sure, this Kemal guy, in the previous election, he said something in the lines of invading Greece.
I want to give Julien this chance to speak
So you can see, like, just to wrap it up,
yeah.
Relationships with Greece and Cyprus will not be improved in my perspective, if the opposition wins.
Yeah.
I'm just laughing about Turkey as a member state of the EU. That's never gonna happen. Let's be honest, guys. Like,
don't spoil their dreams.
no, I'm spoiling everything. Just
Should
bury
I
it.
start or should I wait?
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Take us.
I find this really
Right.
fascinating.
Okay. God damn, where do we start? Okay, number one, I want to remind our viewers, our listeners, that Turkey does not recognize Cyprus as a sovereign nation state. So let's begin there before we start talking about membership. They said that they will, open quotation, Kemal and the coalition, so this memorandum will pursue the objectives of protecting the acquired rights of the occupied territory and all its citizens in Cyprus. Relations with Greece are like one tiny slither above all-time low in my opinion. Of course, it doesn't help that every day Erdogan is threatening to invade Greece and to take the Eastern Aegean. I really don't see how any progress can happen in terms of EU membership when the 2016 memorandum of understanding on migration is not being implemented properly. For instance, Turkey has stopped deportations from not deportations but returns from Greece to Turkey. They used the COVID excuse, but COVID has essentially gone out of the policy limelight for a while now, and they have not returned. At the same time, they're constantly instrumentalizing migration, and there are very clear indications that they're not properly implementing and fulfilling their obligations and rights under their the customs union agreement with the EU. And I just want to point out that Russia is looking very closely at these elections, and they're very clearly hoping for an Erdogan win, just because of how instrumental Erdogan has been in bringing those two countries very close together, especially since the beginning of Russia's unjust and brutal invasion of Ukraine. I think they're important elections because they will tell us a lot about Turkish society and what is happening right now, especially given the abysmal state of Turkey's economy and Erdogan's comical economic policies. But at the same time, like I'm being pragmatic here and seeing that there is not a lot of potential for rapprochement. Like I don't understand why here the EU, in any case, should be the one to make the first step when things have been happening the past years where there's just no excuse whatsoever. I also want to take this moment to say that I think it was a few days ago, let me just find the date, but Turkey did, the Turkish police, the Turkish authorities arrested at least 126 people, apparently for suspected links to Kurdish militant groups, and these included lawyers, journalists, and politicians. So it's a very good sign for Turkey's democracy. Again, this is sarcasm.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to start wrapping up really quickly. Before we leave the selection of elections, one person who sat this out conveniently is Julien.
Hi.
With any final thoughts? I'll give you a minute or two.
I mean, I think, like, I'm going to say what I said last time when we spoke about the elections. Everybody should just ignore the polls. The polls mean fuck all at the moment. Like, polls always have a huge margin of error, and you never know what's going to happen until the election actually happens. It was the same in France when everybody was freaking out about how Le Pen was going to take over or something. Same thing in Scotland, same thing in the German elections and everything. There are always some upsets, even if it doesn't necessarily always happen. So, look, Erdogan's close to Putin, and Putin's been interfering in every election globally for like 20 years now. So, like,
20 years no, but since 2014, definitely.
He's been doing it for a while. Come on, like ever since he was in power, he was doing some shady stuff somewhere. Like this doesn't just come out of nowhere. But the Turkish one, I'm gonna wait and see what happens. I'm leaning towards there's more in favor of Erdogan than against, especially with the weak opposition candidate like Joao said earlier. And with the Finnish election, it's really interesting because I feel like Sanna Marin took a hit from the more moderate right-wing voters when it came to that party scandal that happened, because a lot of the people who instrumentalized that against her all came from the center-right, the right, and the far-right.
Yeah.
And on top of that, I think people really underestimate the effect that being at war has on people's voting preferences. I mean, ask yourself this right now when you're listening to this. Out of all the parties in your country on the spectrum, who do you think of first when it comes to defense? It's the right. Center-right, right-wing, even the far-right, because they're the ones who tend to be more aggressive and more defense-focused. Whereas unless it's a state like Canada or the US, where there is a spectrum on that, there is still hawkish people in the Democrats, in the Canadian Liberals, and this kind of thing, you know?
Canadian Liberals less.
Yeah, sure. But like they exist. Whereas in Europe, you have that to a lesser extent, but you always think of the right wing, and that played in their favor on top of the economic and migrant issues. But I think the big thing about elections this year, throughout the entire spectrum of the year, is just giving us a sounding board of what we can expect next year. Because the parties taking the losses now are the parties who are aware that they are in deep trouble next year. So Ciudadanos is now expecting a complete wipeout in 2024. And that means Spanish liberals gone. The Portuguese liberals aren't expecting much either. And I think now people are leaning more towards it being a case of the Portuguese socialists coming in strong. In Germany as well.
I wouldn't say. No, I wouldn't say. I mean, the Portuguese Liberal are a fairly recent party.
Yeah, no, but they're not expecting like big.
No, not.
Victory,
but I don't expect socialists neither, because they have having a huge backlash.
Okay, we need to have a talk about this after. And the Germans as well. The FDP took hammering. Let's be honest. And the CDU are coming out quite strong, and the right wing is looking more powerful in Germany, at least on the Landtag level. So I mean, I think that's. I think we should be careful about how we're reading all the polls in general. And I'm not expecting that. I mean, the Turkish thing as well. I just can't get over the fact that we're still talking about Turkish accession to the EU. Come on, guys.
It's their playbook.
It'd be nice, but it's not going to happen.
Let's wrap up this episode because we do have a deadline, unfortunately, today. I think this will be our shortest episode we ever recorded. But before we wrap up, I actually want to go around the table and answer what we thought the biggest story of spring 2023 was. You can only choose one. We'll go around. You get a one-word answer, basically. Do we think we can handle this? Julien, I'll start with you because typically you have an idea in your head. And plus, I will say, you didn't mention those French pension protests at all. So kudos to you.
Would you want to mention that?
Not letting you get
Kudos
princess
is the
cake.
right word.
It was a really dumb polemic brought up by the far left. That's it. Listen, it makes sense. Economically, it makes sense. Socially, it makes sense. Everybody retires at 64 anyway. And we also got rid of a lot of
So what's the one story?
the one word.
The one story.
Can I have two?
That's pushing.
Less than 30 seconds, go.
Strategic autonomy.
Really? Okay.
Done.
That should means fair enough. Yeah.
For me, it's actually tough too. But I would have to say Finland joined NATO.
Yeah, I know we didn't talk about it as much, but yeah.
China's visit to Russia.
Yeah. I would still be in the EU-China relations category, but are we optimistic moving out of this podcast studio? Because when I was sitting down, like I was saying, I was most pessimistic writing this up. Because it got quiet now.
The topics itself in the spring has not been like very.
It's not filling me with the sunshine,
like
right?
2023. I guess when we were doing this prospects for the year of 2023, we kind of reflect upon that and thought that maybe this next year was not going to be like very very bright in terms of news. And in some case, it's kind of right because we still have the war enduring, and we have all of this geopolitical tensions looming. So it's difficult. It's difficult to actually see the bright side of things.
Yeah. Should we wrap up on that?
We
Does
should.
anybody have a brighter note?
No, there's always a bright. Come on, guys. We work in
Go,
politics.
go ahead. No, go
what the-
ahead.
Like, come on. Let's not be depressed because we're just making these people feel sad for like 30 minutes at this point.
Don't let them go away sad.
Like, guys, okay, listen, I'm going to be the optimistic one, which
Go
is
for it.
uncharacteristic for the French guy, but there is always cause for optimism. Shit can get a lot worse, but things can get a lot better too. Like, guys, we're arguing about things now. We're seeing a lot of pain points. There's bad things happening in the world, but let's be honest, in politics, if we all gave up hope, all we would have are like Boris Johnson's running around destroying everything. You have to have hope in politics. If you don't have hope in politics, you can't work in politics, you can't read about politics, you can't listen to it, you can't engage in it, it just sucks. And don't get me wrong, I'm a political operative. It sucks sometimes, but you have to be optimistic. Think of what you can do to make things better around you. Think of how, how much joy you get seeing me and Nico fighting about whatever the hell we fight about on a quarterly basis. Think about how nice it is to be like in a nice place. Let's be honest, if you're in the EU, things are good. And think about how you can have a positive impact on your community. And then just, smile and just feel happy.
Are you announcing your candidacy for something?
Yeah, because
So by the way-
I would sign.
Yeah, I will sign that
I would
petition
sign it
too.
too. Yeah.
Let's go. Start a petition, see where we can go,
There we go.
All right.
Okay. On that note, I think we're done then for this month. And hopefully maybe next month, the month thereafter, we'll do something else fun. We'll
Can I
get
do
a
the
nice
clap?
experience. Oh, yes, go to the clap. And we're done.
Boom.
Nice.